Hello and a very warm welcome to this edition of Insight. Under the leadership of Prime Minister Narendra Modi, India's new government has made its relations with East Asian neighbours a foreign policy priority. It has been called the Act East policy in the line of the Look East policy, which was introduced during the Narasimha Rao government in the 1990s and was implemented by the successive NDA and the UPA governments. India hopes to strengthen its economic, trade and strategic ties with its East Asian neighbours through consultations, dialogues and joint exercises. So in today's edition of Insight, we discuss the various dimensions of the Act East policy. And my guests today are Mr. N. Madhavan, Senior Associate Editor with Hindustan Times, and Professor Abhijit Das, who's head with the Center for WTO Studies, Indian Institute of Foreign Trade. And very soon we'll be joined by some other experts too. But let me quickly start the discussion with you, Professor Das. How do you look at the developments that we have seen around the Prime Minister's visit to various countries and the fact that there has been an emphasis on Act East? He has said that we have done enough of looking, now it's time to act and engage more with our eastern neighbours.
I would say that the developments have been very positive and it does lay down enough grounds for optimism for the future. The number of MOUs that were signed, the other deals that were inked does point to the fact that not only will we be looking east, we've already started acting east. To give you an example, one of the MOUs signed with China relates to having a closer cooperation with China at the WTO. This is something for the first time. And if India and China coordinate their positions at the WTO, certainly they will be a very big, strong, powerful force, something which the rest of the WTO membership just cannot ignore. That is one. Then the investments that have been promised as a consequence of Honorable Prime Minister's visit, that gives optimism for the future as well. But this optimism, for it to fructify on the ground, requires us also to act within, look within. We have to take action within ourselves, within the country, to make sure that the opportunities which will come about because of the leadership shown by the Prime Minister, we are able to take full advantage of those opportunities.
Okay. Mr. Madhavan, how do you look at the fact that, you know, when the Prime Minister visited China recently, from 24 agreements between the two governments to about 21 more agreements between the firms, the Indian and the Chinese firms, what does it say about the way India is engaging a lot with its neighbours and these agreements, though they might be on any issue? For example, amidst the list of those MOUs, one had to really find out as to where exactly India and China are, you know, they are really coming together, from soft areas like education, health, vocational training, skill development, to building railways, infrastructure, mining. How do you look at all that?
Yeah, I think it's a good point, but let me first take a historical look so that you will understand why this is suddenly, you know, this is like watching, as I say, a soap opera at a certain episode, so it's important to have a recap. See, the colonial roots of India and China, and what is known by in some academic circles as Eurocentrism, had created this paradoxical situation where we had stopped watching our neighbors and we were looking at everything with a telescope that we forgot our normal eyesight. So we were not looking near, which is why Narasimha Rao, when he was Prime Minister, had to start a Look East policy, which Narendra Modi has developed into an Act East policy since last year, as the East Asia Summit took place.
Right.
But this, between Narasimha Rao and Narendra Modi, around nearly 25 years have passed. And we need to understand what has happened in those 25 years, which makes what you say very interesting. When the 1980s, the so-called East Asian tigers emerged, even China was not really in the picture. China began its reforms in 1979. So people were at that time talking about Korea, South Korea, Taiwan, then Malaysia and Indonesia and all. So ASEAN was the flavor of the decade in 1980s. So India was trying to first engage ASEAN. China was this big monster behind the Great Wall. So we weren't really looking at what was going on in China.
Sure.
But China was taking off as a 1 billion people economy. So it became a manufacturing base for the world. India became a software and services base for the world. So this side of Everest, this was going on, that side of Everest, this was going on. And suddenly when the 21st century dawned, it was like a great scene in this economic soap opera where you have two giant economies coming together, the dragon and the elephant. So you have, so Chindia was being touted as a slogan in the 90s. Today Chindia is an emerging fact. And a lot of the agreements that you talk about are essentially a sense of from looking to acting, from government to government interactions to private sector interactions, from multi-sectoral views to intra-sectoral opportunities. So this is like a grid being formed now, best symbolizes by the ancient romantic idea of the Silk Route. But today the Silk Route is in the sky in a way. You can have flights from Mumbai to Shanghai, and then you have the port lines coming from there. There may be other political, geopolitical tensions and some of the other issues that which are part of the background. But the interesting thing about what President Xi and Prime Minister Modi have done is they have stopped looking at each other through some Western prism or through some ideological prism of communism versus market economy. They see both the commonality between China and India amid all the differences.
Right.
And I'm not just talking, we have to discuss ASEAN also separately, but right now we are hot off the oven is the Prime Minister's visit to China. So we have to look at the fact that China and India are now looking at both as wounded civilizations trying to bounce back in the 21st century.
That's right. And they have got and received enough attention from the West.
And this is no longer a slogan.
Right.
The Chinese economic engine, thanks to the slowdown and the crisis in the West, has become a more of an internal economy. And India is anyway a 1 billion. India has got 900 million mobile connections, which is very symbolic of how big an economy is. So these giants in an embrace are creating a grand uncoupling of the global economy from the West.
Right.
So that is the context in which we are engaging as we look east or act east.
But you see, and you look anywhere in the market and you see a cooperation between India and Korea, India and Taiwan, India and Japan, India and China. I mean, that speaks a lot about how our market has imbibed things coming from all these countries so beautifully. It has in fact merged into our market so nicely now that today you have to. Yeah.
I've coined a new term today while waiting for you to call me to the program. I call it the new multilateralism.
The new multilateralism. Fine. But how should one look at the way these countries are engaging, and does it speak a lot about globally how the economies are growing and in which way they are growing? Because much was in fact said about the new world economic order about 5 years ago. Do you think that transition is very much reflective in India's gestures?
Yes, you're very correct. That transition is now clearly emerging, and India has started engaging more forcefully with that transition. Let me elaborate. The transition really is that manufacturing has really shifted from the developed world to the hubs in China, Korea, even Vietnam, parts of other ASEAN countries, Malaysia for example. But India's own linkages in these emerging global value chains, that's what these are called, has so far been not very strong. And if we look at some of the trade agreements that have been negotiated over the past few years, these are really aimed at making sure that India does not miss out in integrating with these global value chains. Let me recount. We entered into a comprehensive economic partnership agreement with Singapore in 2005. That was followed by a spate of similar agreements with Korea, ASEAN, Malaysia, Japan. So those really were symbolic of our look east. But why that really has so far not effectively translated into act east is if we look at or consider to what extent our exporters have utilized the tariff preferences under these agreements, and the record is not very optimistic. So perhaps with the added emphasis on act east, our exporters, the business community, might try to reorient their focus away from the developed country markets, away from the Western world, and shift their gaze to China, to ASEAN, to Japan, to Korea. not an easy task. They would really have to comply with the exim requirements in these countries, comply with slightly different standards than what prevail in other countries. They may need to reorient their business processes, but I'm sure that can be done given the fact that a huge opportunity awaits our industry. And that opportunity really is getting created by the engagements which the government is doing with the countries like China, Korea, Japan, ASEAN, etc. And another good way in which this engagement is getting reflected is our attempt to get into something called the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement. That really is an agreement being negotiated between ASEAN 10 and countries like Australia, New Zealand, India, China, Japan, Korea. And once that agreement is finalized and comes into force, that perhaps would really be a test of how serious we are about Act East #1, and whether we are able to take full advantage of opportunities that agreements like RCEP would provide for our business and industry.
Okay, fine. On that note, we'll take a very quick break in Insight. Please stay tuned for more on the other side of this break. And joining me in the program is Dr. Ramupendra Das, Professor with Research and Information System for Developing Countries, and Dr. Arvind Prasad, who is the DG FICCI, also joins me on the panel. Welcome to the program. We'll quickly start the discussion with you, Dr. Das. How do you look at the steps that the government has been taking and the perception that it has of its eastern neighbors, and the fact that the Prime Minister now says that we have done enough of looking, we have also engaged with them, it's time to now act and have an Act East policy?
Well, in my understanding, this is a very remarkable thrust given by the new government. But I would like to mention that Look East policy, which began in early 90s, it has got impetus governments after government, be it Congress in different regimes, or the third front government, or the two regimes of the NDA. An impression was created in the eastern side of our neighborhood that India pronounces, agrees, but falls short on implementation, and that is why this terminology shift from Look East to Act East. It is a good shift, but I always maintain that the very fact that we started looking at East was also an act of action. So we should not take away that credit away from that. But what is remarkable in this new thrust on Act East policy of Government of India is that some of the contentious relationships in the region are now getting a more positive undertone. And that's very significant. And if you disaggregate that, then you would realize that while India engaged bilaterally with Thailand, Singapore, Malaysia, Japan, South Korea, and negotiations are underway with Indonesia, Australia, and New Zealand, two of the most important partners, which is India and China, were not economically interacting in any formal trade agreement, so to say, or comprehensive economic partnership agreement. Even today, we don't have a bilateral agreement. Given the fact that these are the two most important economies in the region. Also, this relationship assumes special significance because the world now realizes that the center of economic gravity has shifted to Asia, and as everybody is saying that this is going to be an Asian century. So it is but natural that India and China have to get into a partnership mode, more cooperation in various dimensions, even if we feel that we are still not prepared to sign a comprehensive partnership economic agreement with them. It is fine because we are interacting with China also in the ASEAN +6 framework, which is ASEAN 10 countries, Japan, South Korea, India, China, Australia, and New Zealand. So maybe it is time that India and China cooperate in the RCEP negotiations, as they are captioned, and you would find that one of the MOUs or declarations that were actually floated during the visit of Prime Minister Modi, out of the 24, one is cooperation between India and China on trade negotiations. Now that would mean trade negotiations in the region,
right.
And also cooperation on trade negotiations at the multilateral level, which is WTO.
That's right.
Because that is where India was isolated when
Right.
food security versus trade facilitation agreement was being debated. So I guess these augur very well, because these are the hot spots of economic dynamism. India itself is emerging, and I think the aspirations of our people can best be served by hooking up to the eastern side of the neighborhood. But at the same time, I would say that I do not believe in the philosophy of total decoupling from the Western world. I think our engagements with the North America and Europe would remain important.
Right.
But at the same time, we should not miss the bus in terms of tapping the economic dynamism that exists in the eastern side.
Okay, and Dr. Prasad, do you see that there is a lot of optimism even within the country when it comes to engaging with these nations, given the fact that the Prime Minister had used every platform to speak about Make in India, to ensure that the companies, the corporate giants, the firms should get together and should engage more, with each other? How do you look at those moves?
No, you are right. That, as the other panelists have explained, that look, East policy itself is quite old now. It is 25 years. What has changed is the domestic context. The domestic context on focus on Make in India, focus on follow up to Make in India is ease of doing business, follow the major thrust on creating basic infrastructure, if not entire country, at least throughout the industrial corridors, focus on major infrastructure projects in railways, focus on domestic production in defense, on other sector, renewable energies. So all these have changed the domestic context, where the Indian businessman or industry earlier, or even to an extent, finds it difficult to compete with or take the full benefit of various trade agreements we have with our neighboring countries. That one part, that easing of doing business in India, creating infrastructure, creating logistic, all those will make it possible for Indian industry and business to compete with our neighboring countries which have a good manufacturing infrastructure.
But Dr. Prasad, do you think that in practical view too, things are really changing, or is it a promise that has been given so far? Because about ease of doing business, about ensuring that we have less bottlenecks, more work in our country, and things like whether it's to do with the various clearances in the form of environment or land acquisition and things like that. Do you see that things have changed on the ground, or things are going to change? What is it basically?
Many things have changed. Many things are in the pipeline. Works have been initiated.
And there is optimism as well.
And there are others which have to follow. So, for example, liberalization on foreign direct investment. You mentioned the clearance of environment and the forest clearances. So many of the procedural things have already been done. What is being done is now to look at all the acts and to have a unified code, so it can be made further simpler. On the taxation, the issue was about retrospective effect of the tax. Their government has made this commitment that it will not go for any retrospective amendment on the taxes.
Right.
The major issue is the GST, the goods and service tax. So government has already initiated the action on that. The constitutional amendment bill is in the parliament. So in that sense, it is work in progress. Something has been done, something is being done, it is in the pipeline. Major thing will happen once the GST gets passed. Similarly, on the infrastructure, Delhi-Mumbai industrial corridor, Bengaluru different industrial corridors, the different projects have been announced. It is the process of implementation.
Right.
So what I would say, similarly on labor laws, many simplifications have already been done. Many amendments in the rules or the act are being considered.
Right.
So I would say that as the government announced its intention, and what is positive about that, in spite of criticism or from various other sectors, governments continue to focus on this.
Okay.
That ease of doing business will be their priority,
Okay.
and they will focus on that.
Okay, Mr. Madhavan, looking at the fact that the Prime Minister also spoke about these very important legislations and changes in the form of GST, the land acquisition and other things, while he was interacting with the Chinese firms there, what does it basically say? Is he trying to give an impression that even domestically we are trying to improve things, so it's not just that we are giving you false promises, you can indeed come and make in India, you can really bring in the investment, we are going to ensure your, a smooth functioning and a smooth clearance procedure. I mean, how do you look at these
let me
statements?
take a bit of what Dr. Das and Prasad said right now. The two very important things they said, which actually ties in very well with what you asked and what I am trying to say. One of them is that we cannot ignore the Western economies because we are looking east. Therefore, the Western economies remain very significant, both in terms of economic opportunity as well as overall significance. The other thing he said was about all the ease of business, doing business and other things. Now, the important thing is Mr. Modi has set for himself an action-oriented approach, and given his own track record in Gujarat, and there are some targets being set for, I think, September for going up the ranks. So, earlier there was always macroeconomic targets used to be discussed. GDP, growth, inflation. Now we are talking about targets in terms of ease of doing business and ranking, which will attract investments into India. But the question I am asking you today, because of this particular panel, is what is the relevance of the Chinese visit and what is the relevance of the look east aspect? Because the rest of what is, the doors are open for business for anyone, whether the person comes from Paraguay or Papua New Guinea or Japan or Canada. So the real issue is what is the east in the east that we are talking about?
Okay.
And the important thing to remember there is that lots of opportunities are being discovered beyond the traditional shade, what is that word for it? We had invisible shades over our eyes. We weren't looking beyond. Now the important thing is that we are looking at which are the sectors where we can actually cooperate. So here I call the 3C problem is coming into picture. Earlier, the earlier question was, are we competitors? Are we collaborators? Or are we? Now I am asking, are we complementers? It's bad. It sounds awful in English. Partners.
Yeah.
But the point is, it's alliteratively sounds good. The important point to remember is now this is where an important point I want to make comes in, which is that we are in an era of globalization, not simple bilateralism of import and export. What does globalization mean? It is that there is a new culture of doing things, where I think Dr. Das just mentioned a very important point. What is that? Global value. There is a global value chain. There is, some people call it the global industrial network. Some people call it the global value chain. So, for instance, Singapore today has Temasek, which is a sovereign fund, which has loads of money to invest. Now, the money comes to India. It might come to Coimbatore, because Coimbatore has somebody who's very good at one aspect of engineering. Now, big picture would be that China is great for engineering goods because of the manufacturing base. But we have in Coimbatore or Pune, some extremely specialized, globally competitive automotive or engineering setup. Fashion design can today be done out of Gurgaon for a Paris fashion show or a Cannes Milan fashion show. So we need intelligent agents, which include private equity, sovereign funds, consulting companies, all putting together new global value network.
Okay.
So what is important for India in the Chinese visit is that we have begun to see the details of opportunity as opposed to just general statement of intent. For instance, India can make some hardware, China can go do some software, Indian software companies can go and engage in the education sector in China in some way, whereas India will issue e-visas to Chinese so that we'll get Chinese tourists. Mandarin is being taught in Delhi now, whereas vegetarian restaurants are opening up in China. This is the new multilateralism I speak of.
Fine. On that note, we'll take a very quick break in Insight. Please stay tuned for more on the other side of this break. Okay, you said something very crucial about the WTO. How do you look at the fact that these countries can really be seen as strong partners and, as nations that will voice the concerns of the developing world and at the forums like the WTO and the other forums? How strong do you think is that development?
Oh, it's a very significant development. If we look at the various issues which the WTO membership is currently grappling with, I think India and China tick more boxes together in terms of articulating concerns that are common not only to these two countries but also to countries in Africa, countries in Latin America. So to that extent, if India and China coordinate their positions, certainly that would provide enough impetus, considerable momentum for realizing the development promise which was contained in the Doha round when it was launched. So I would think it's a very, very important development, not only for these two countries, but also for the larger WTO membership, particularly the developing countries.
And we have seen that cooperation on other fronts like, like the climate change.
Oh, yes.
And that's where we found there was a joint statement there too, as to what kind of an understanding has been brought in between these two countries. Dr. Das, one of the important partners here for India is Myanmar, because the trade between India and Myanmar, in fact, has doubled in the last 7 years. And in fact, the whole idea behind the Look East and the Act East policy has been to see how trade and investment opportunities can grow. The fact that there are some other issues too in which the countries are trying to engage, whether it's to do with building infrastructure or to ensure that even political support can be given, aid can be provided to countries in order to, bring out stability in the entire region. How do you look at the cooperation with these countries? Because it's not just all economic. There are different other aspects too related to how two countries should engage with each other.
Yes, if I draw your attention to both the budget announcement of this year and also the foreign trade policy, Government of India has initiated a very important program of what is called as Project Development Company, which will create special purpose vehicles to set up manufacturing units in Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar and Vietnam. So today, we are trying to look at Myanmar in a more holistic manner as part of CLMV region, the Mekong region. And this is very significant because and I was associated with that, work of the government. This is a very significant study because this is the region which is a laggard region in ASEAN 10 countries. Okay, so there is a clear divide between 6 ASEAN and these 4 ASEAN countries. And these are geographically proximate. Their underdevelopment is an opportunity for India. Regional value chains, which was perhaps discussed here, has almost bypassed, barring Vietnam, of the Southeast Asian kind, and India also has not been able to develop very significant regional value chains of the order and magnitude and scale of the Southeast Asian countries. So India's engagement with the CLMV region, including Myanmar, would be very crucial if we adopt this holistic economic cooperation approach where our manufacturing units are facilitated by government, and that generates employment there as well as here, because there are a lot of things that we can manufacture and import back. That is one. Second is our profits can be plowed back in other ventures within our country, and third is we can make this CLMV as an export platform to take advantage of various markets in Asia and globally, and we get hooked to regional and global value chains. Now in this context, your question was very important when we mention Myanmar, because that is where we have borders with Northeast, and many of the infrastructural projects of especially road connectivity are already there, including the trilateral highway between India, Myanmar and Thailand. But what has been happening is that these projects have been slow, and one of the reasons, as understood, was that because of we not having a more comprehensive approach towards the entire Lok East policy and towards the entire Mekong region, these projects were not taking off because people were not understanding the relevance of it. Now that we are trying to posit these infrastructural connectivity projects in the little wider sense of engaging the CLMV region, and through that integrating more with the rest of the Southeast Asian countries and accessing markets in Japan, South Korea, China and so on, I think some of the bottlenecks that were there in terms of lack of implementation of these projects would be perhaps addressed. And also these countries will now realize that now India is actually acting in a more holistic and comprehensive manner, and that is why there were bottlenecks from their side also, because of some of the political considerations. These were not getting cleared at the pace and scale that one would have aspired for.
Okay, if I ask you again, looking at the way India is engaging with these countries, what kind of investment do you think is going to come from outside, in order to address these issues too? Because I read a report which said that even we need to build in this infrastructure towards the northeast part, and on that aspect, India expects to engage more with its neighbors, so that there also, to an extent, the benefits of those investments can be utilized there, can be used there. The 10,000 kilometer stretch of the highway and things like that. What would you like to say about that?
Let me do a bit of crystal ball gazing. Investments would come into India in different parts of the country, primarily if the foreign investor sees good prospects of economic growth in the country so that he can get high returns, if he sees and perceives stability of laws within the country. So if we are able to ensure both stability of laws as well as prospects of high economic growth in the country, certainly investments will pour into the country. What would be the quantum? I'm afraid it would be very, very speculative on my part. But I do want to drive home one point, that if we have to attract investment, one area which needs real attention is building good infrastructure. We have taken some measures. The Mumbai corridor has been alluded to by some of the panelists, but that may not be enough. We really need to look at infrastructure development at the ports, port to hinterland connectivity, real significant improvements in logistics. We have improved, no doubt, but if we compare ourselves with best in the world, we've slipped behind. So it's really not a question of improving with ourselves. We need to peg ourselves with where other countries are proceeding, and if we are able to make improvements over what others have done, then we will certainly attract investment.
Okay, Mr. Madhavan, the fact that now, as I said, the areas of engagement are many, from renewable energy to, to anything like building infrastructure, mining, an area like that. What does it really say about the engagements that are happening? And, nobody really gets to know the details behind those MOUs. So many of them have been signed. But if you, if you start picking one and then start reading as to what it really means for the country, only then one would understand, fine, this is what it means. It's not just a company-to-company MOU. It's rather for the benefit of both the countries. How would you like to, elaborate on that aspect, especially on the energy aspect, because many would say that it's the energy and the economy which is going to really decide the might of these nations in this century.
I think as far as energy is concerned, as far as I understand, these are big ticket items. Therefore, renewable energy is a separate story. We will come to that. But I think conventional energy such as petroleum, fossil fuel based energies, there are big companies, very knowledgeable companies. The problems they face essentially in engaging government are political in nature, where there is a militancy or they are ecological in nature. I think these problems can be surmounted the moment the political will is shown. So historically, if you look at it, India had a somewhat uneasy relationship with Myanmar on the political side, and so was China. The Modi government is trying to break that. I think that surmounting of the political barrier will take care of some of the issues on the energy cooperation front. Although, for instance, I have some reports to some extent that India and China are sort of rivals in Myanmar. I really don't know whether they should be considered rivals or not, because the Chinese want to invest, the Indians want to invest. Similarly, Vietnam also, there are some stories about how ONGC is having problems because of China saying something. So there are some diplomatic issues that need to be resolved. Beyond the atmospherics of Modi's visit to China, we even joked in India that if it's made in China, it should last. But the other, let me come to that. Let me come to the other pet topic of mine. On things like renewable energy and IT and other industries, there are two aspects, things to be mentioned.
Yeah.
Only these MOUs are signed, but who is going to take the MOUs message forward? The government can only do so much. What we need is a sense of evangelism. That's for people like the FICCI to do, so that entrepreneurs and businesses really know that this is a new world opening up. So we need the evangelism of opportunities, and thanks to internet and things, we need to create detailed, I call the metrics of opportunities. There should be a clear, people who can benefit from these MOUs must clearly get to know that they can. Because the usual complaint against MOUs is that after they are signed, no one really uses. Because it is not for two joint secretaries in the Ministry of External Affairs to do this. It is for the consultants and the evangelists to take it forward.
Okay, I'll have to take a very quick break now. Inside, please stay tuned for more on the other side of this break. Welcome back in Inside Today, a discussion on India's Act East policy. Okay, Dr. Prasad, if I ask you, while we talk so much about ensuring that we act towards the eastern part and we really do much and engage a lot with these countries, what are the basic things that you think needs to be removed, the problems that we've had in the past while we were really trying to look and engage with the East?
As I mentioned to you, that the change in the domestic circumstances itself, and I'll just mention the topics you raised in just before the break about the infrastructure and energy.
Right.
If you look at the MOUs, which the 26 MOUs were signed with Chinese companies and Indian companies, if you look at the energy particularly, which you mentioned, there is a specific agreement with a specific company. Welspun has signed with Chinese company for manufacturing photovoltaic cells in India. So as the government of India has announced that they will, in next 5 to 7 years, they will have 100 gigawatts of solar power developed in the country, set up in the country. This manufacturing is a real opportunity, and it is a real engagement between two business entities. So it is not an MOU between joint secretaries, it is between the companies. If you look at the MOU which was signed with Infosys, it is about the IT infrastructure. If you see the MOU which was signed by NIIT, it is about training IT personnel in China. If you see the MOU which was signed by Adani, it was about the port development in the Mundra, and also about the SEZ, where the solar energy will be developed, gas power will be developed. ILFS has signed on coal-based power plants. So if all these MOUs, and with Korea, you know that among other things, one of the critical issues which we face in energy sector is the unviability of our utilities company, our power distribution companies, and primarily because of high losses in the system. Sometimes it is as high as 25-30%. So one of the MOUs is about a smart grid, the operation of distribution network which will manage these losses. So what I am trying to say, that these MOUs have moved beyond the standard MOUs which used to be between the government, between the two political establishment, to the actual business entity.
Actually, I have to stop in and thank Mr. Prasad for giving the details, because I was operating on the basis of the historical assumption of what MOU constitutes. MOUs are historically between governments, whereas the way Mr. Prasad elaborates is very clear that these are not MOUs, they are business agreements which for want of a better term is called MOUs. Because normally MOUs are frameworks. They do not, are not about companies, or they are not even about specific industries to some extent. They are about sectors to some extent. So it's good that a lot of detail has come into place. Except that this is surprisingly quite possible that.
I mean, if you just look at India and Korea, whether it's engaging with companies like the LG, the Samsung, and then a POSCO, whose project is stalled here in Odisha. What does it really say about the way things have been? And, because I want to really draw a very realistic picture here. When we say we're going to act, it's not just about inviting the companies and telling them that you can invest here, because we are a conglomeration of so many states, with so many governments, with so many other issues. Is the situation really changing, or are we just in that optimistic mood? We are promising the world that yes, things are going to change. Dr. Prasad.
No, so that is
and the fact that the industries are looked at as a different entity altogether in our country. They are seen as somebody who is not even bothered about what's really happening at the, at the ground level of the landowner or of any other person who's the affected party in most of the cases, because we have a huge population of tribal people, forest dwellers. What about all
Gently remind you we are a democracy.
No. When I was giving you the examples, I was giving you examples from two perspectives. One, that it was a real MOU between a real business entity. But I was also giving you examples which I wanted to convey, that these are the MOUs which has real business potential. It is not just wishful projects. When you set up a solar PV manufacturing plant, well-spun, actually manufacture, there is a business opportunity. Right. It is not that conceptual framework. If you improve the port, Mundra port with Guangzhou port, there is a real business opportunity.
But Dr. Prasad, are we going to really create those many number of jobs with this kind of investment coming into the country? I mean, do we have a realistic assessment of that too?
See, there are two ways of looking at it. When you look at Make in India and ease of doing business, of course we talk in the context, quite often talk in the context of large business entity. But you also look at other similar ongoing projects like Jan Dhan Yojana, you say Digital India, you say skill missions. If you look at all, you say the universal social security mechanism. All these and ease of doing business. So ease of doing business is not only just for the large corporates. Large corporates, you are aware that even with the difficult circumstances, they are able to manage, if not in this state, in another state. But ease of doing business will really mean for the small, medium business units. Whereas, so if you have Digital India, which provides you the information right up to the village, if you have Jan Dhan Yojana, which provides you financial services right up to the village, you have universal social security schemes.
Right.
So people are not necessarily looking for organized sector jobs just because they need health care, they need pensions.
Right.
So all these framework, to my mind, will create a business environment where ease of doing business will
where
be,
everybody would be a party
to
that
small entrepreneurs,
to that
two,
change.
There are
people.
opportunities
Yes.
and there are obstacles.
So,
absolutely.
So what he says is that the smart businessman will anyway look at the opportunities and manage to surmount the obstacles.
And it is certainly a very one would say very positive environment that way. Professor Das, how do you look at one of the critical factors which of course in relation to China has been a concern for us, which is the trade imbalance? Do you think that the great trade deficit, as one would say, while engaging with these nations, how to address that issue? Do you think that should be one of the critical areas?
Well, that certainly should be a critical area, and it should also not be a critical area from some other perspective. Let me try to elaborate this supposed inconsistency. If we are talking of value chains, then we would end up importing inputs and raw materials and exporting the final product. So that certainly could lead to a trade deficit vis-a-vis one country. So that might not be a matter of concern. But why the trade deficit with China is a matter of concern is if we look at what are we exporting to China and what are we importing.
That's right.
So that really is a matter of concern. And some of the discussions that apparently have taken place during the Prime Minister's visit really relate to how to address this issue. And clearly one way of going forward is easing the procedures by which our pharmaceutical products can get entry into China, or having fast-track mechanisms for getting what are called SPS approvals for our agricultural products. So these mechanisms, if they are put into place, if they are operationalized and done quickly, certainly would help in bridging the trade deficit. But really we are fairly long way off from when we could say that, well, the trade deficit is more or less balanced.
And you see that it's not just our need to engage with these countries, it is these countries' need too to engage with India, keeping in mind that India's...
It's also important to remember there are hardcore ground economic realities. In China is a cheap manufacturing base, and India is a huge consumer of electronics and other items right now, and therefore there is a fundamental consumption bias that's favoring India.
Dr. Das.
Yeah, no, just on trade deficit. If you see first of all, you see both kinds of MOUs are important. Government to government and business to business.
Right.
Trade negotiations MOU cannot be, done at the business to business.
True.
So it is important to harmonize or enmesh the macro with the micro. That is one. Second is, if you see some of those areas of business MOUs, whether it is equipment with Bharti Airtel signing the counterpart, or steel project, the Welspun was mentioned, hot rolled steel coil project. These are those areas that were actually contributing to India's trade deficit with China. Because we were, for instance...
So we are addressing that.
We are addressing. We were,
through these MOUs.
yeah, we were exporting iron ore and we were importing equipments.
Right.
Now, if we have steel projects here with Chinese investment, then that need for import will go away. If we
Dr. Das,
manufacture
I'll have to wrap up the discussion. I'm so sorry. Very quickly, if I just ask you in 2 lines, if you can explain. These groupings, how do you think these groupings are going to take this relationship forward? Whether it's the ASEAN, it's the BIMSTEC, IBSA, the BASIC, how do you look at that? Very quickly, sir.
No, these are different levels of grouping. So BASIC is in climate change, which is multilateral. But in ASEAN, with ASEAN plus 6, it is regional. I think India-China relationship in both would definitely be on the same side of the page, while we may remain, we may have some discomfiture at the bilateral level.
Okay, fine. On that note, I'll have to wrap up this discussion. Thank you very much, gentlemen, for joining us here.